please have sound now? Hello. Dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, and dear guests, very, very welcome to Denmark and to Copenhagen, where we have our 4th European Public Health Conference this year. In your conference bag, you will find this, and you can see that we have used this year a number of so-called bridge symbols for the conduct of you to the various rooms at the conference center. I think I would like to tell you that in this country, we now and then have a tradition where we open a congress or conference with a song. Please look into your conference bag and you will find a song. I've written it because I hope that we can start a tradition where we open our European conferences with a from year to year modified song. And could I please ask the EUPHA choir to stand up and sing along, and if others want to sing along, then please do it. Then I go to my keyboard and I play the song. It's a traditional thing. We'll meet again is the melody behind it. And I think that at least the older part of this conference knows how it is. When we next year go to Malta, I hope we can continue the tradition. But I have a few opening remarks to you. First of all, this is a traditional conference, but we have tried to moderate some of the traditions into something which is, I think, basically invented by the chairman of the scientific committee, Kamper-Jorgensen, which is what we call moderated poster sessions. A lot of people have been not too happy just to present their poster. They wanted also a discussion. And therefore, a moderated poster session which does not take place together with oral presentations, but is a separate entity. You get a headset, you put it on your head, and then the speaker presents to you his poster. And we've tried to be a little bit innovative this year. And I thank Torben for this very good idea, and we will see how it works. Then, of course, we have invited very good plenary sessions. We've chosen the title of combining public health and welfare. I come from a Scandinavian country which has more than 100 years of a tradition of welfare policies. We live in a world with economic constraints and economic crisis, and one of the ideas was to find out, are our modern societies in Europe sufficient for not being destroyed by economic crisis? And I hope we get from our plenary speakers and from our various sessions a good response on what we know from professional things and from our research. We have a lot of, as you can see from this program, of oral presentations, and we have a number of plenary sessions. And for example, one of the things we prioritized when we planned the Danish conference here was to find out if we have robust modern societies from a welfare perspective, to be sure that the public health is not destroyed if we are confronted with the economic crisis. You will find in this program what I call the bridge symbols. It is found here, and those sessions you want to join, you just have to look at the bridge. Denmark is a country with a hell of a lot of islands, and we have a lot of bridges. And this was the choice of people with good ideas, that we should use that. So you can look for the bridge, or you can look for the name of a session you want to join. In this program, there is an overview where you can find what is, from an overview perspective, going on. There is a presentation of all our keynote lectures, and I think I would thank all of our keynote lectures, because we think we have a fantastic panel to present their knowledge and their presentation to the modern challenges. Then there is in the program a welcome from me and from two presidents, because the Danish Society of Public Health is a local organizer, but we do it in conjunction with the European Public Health Association and ASPHER, which has to deal with schools of public health in Europe. So we are the three key components of what has been going on. You can find in this program the program details. You can find a list of organizers, of sponsors, and of economic support. We simply cannot conduct, at least not in this country, a conference like the one we are conducting now without heavy economic support. And I'm very happy and I'm grateful to both public authorities and to private sponsors. And you can find them in this program, where their logo and their name is So I'm very happy with this. Also, I would tell you that if you want to be a tourist in this country right now, well, I remember when I was in Portugal a couple of years ago, it was nice weather and so on, but it's goddamn cold in Denmark for the time being. But we've just found out that in Tivoli, you can find a Russian opening starting on Friday. And there's an opening for the Christmas session, so to speak. And outside, there is also from the conference bureau called Wonderful Copenhagen, there is information on what you can do if you want to do any tourism, if you want to get information on transportation and things like that. So we have done what we can do to give you the best form of service on this. This is a non-smoking conference. Get out of the building if you want to smoke. Let me tell you that we have something which is called speaker's room. And in speaker's room, all of you who have to prepare for presenting your case, you have to go to the speaker's room and ask them to upload. There you get technical help, and then they'll show you to the room. Tonight there are two different welcome receptions. Some of you have chosen to go to the reception in the City Hall of Copenhagen. It is 7:30. If you want to stay in this Bella Center, the reception begins at 18:45. And I want to tell you also that on Friday we have in what is called the Øksnehal, a special place. You can read about this in the program. There is a conference dinner. We have been 4 key persons planning this conference. 2 from the EUPHA organization and 2 from the Danish Society of Public Health. And I'm very, very grateful for this cooperation in order to be able to present what is going on the next few days. So, wonderful Copenhagen, as Danica sang, and you're later going to be introduced to Hans Christian Andersen, the fairy tale, with a special group. But now I have to hand over the floor to the president of EUPHA and the president of ASPHER in order also to say very heartily welcome to Copenhagen and to this conference.
On behalf of the European Public Health Association, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all in Copenhagen and to thank very much the Danish Society of Public Health and the International Scientific Committee, the local organizing committee, in the persons of Finn Kamper-Jorgensen and Torben, because I think they did a fantastic job, and the beginning is really exciting. This is the last of a series of conferences that have been growing and growing since EUPHA was born in 1992. And since 4 years, we organized the conference together with ASPHER. And from 12 to 41 countries in 19 years is a big growth for EUPHA. And now we are very happy to see that this conference are an important opportunity for our members, which are many, from different countries, from different sources, from different backgrounds, from different disciplines, from different institutions, to present the results of their research, and moreover to start to make the result of their research implemented in policy and practice. We are a community of more than 14,000 public health professionals coming from the world of research, of the policy, of practice, and we believe that this is an important opportunity to integrate our work together. But what has our community, what has our association, European Public Health Association, produced in the past 20 years concerning the main issue, the main theme of the conference? Certainly the evidence. The evidence of the past years is that communities with high levels of civic engagement, a strong institutional infrastructure for civic participation, and a vibrant entrepreneurial economic climate should have better health and lower rates of all-cause mortality. And for this opening remark, I've picked some of the main evidence coming from some of the people that are also some of them are also in this audience, to confirm this evidence in order to support our work for the future in times of certainly serious challenge, in particular from the financial point of view. This evidence is true not only from Europe, but also from other countries in which we are not used to think about welfare as a very important asset, because the analysis that welfare and civic engagement is important comes out also from the study that the CDC Wonder System database for all countries in the United States provided. And they show that this is evidence that substantial support for the civic community perspectives. Maybe that in time of financial crisis, of credit crunch, we may believe that the competitive approach, the free market approach is the winning one. Is not. There is an evidence coming from the United States that Tom Rice, who is writing a chapter on this on the next edition of the Oxford Handbook of Public Health Practice, they have examined over a dozen of the assumptions that would need to be fulfilled to ensure that a free market results in the best outcome for society. And they found none of them even close to being met in health. So the economic theory provides no basis for assuming the superiority of competitive approach. Rather welfare, rather public health, rather collaboration between the different sectors as its impact. Because increased generosity in family policies that support dual earner families is like with lower infant mortality rates. And generosity in basic security type of pension is associated with lower old age excess mortality. Early intervention can improve the life chances of young children living in deprived areas. And rapid mass privatization as an economic transition strategy was a crucial determinant of differences in adult mortality trends in post-communist countries. And the effect of a privatization was reduced, even in those terrible situations if social capital was high. Each 1% increase in membership of a social organization decreased the association of privatization with mortality by 0.27%. The problem is that underlying determinants of health inequity and environmental change, which are the two main threats for our future, overlap substantially. They are signs of an economic system predicated on asymmetric growth and competition shaped by market forces that mostly disregard health and environmental consequences rather than by values of fairness and support. We don't want that, but it's not enough that we produce good research results. We must take care of a successful change, and taking inspiration by Julio Frank, who is the Dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, our agenda, our budget, our capacity, our deliverables, and our evidence should really be put on the table to lead our communities to a better health. Because the risk is that the increasing inequalities that we are storing up for our children and grandchildren are simply wrong and are largely preventable. We can do a lot with our knowledge we already have if we choose to use it. We have no right, I want to underline that we have no right to use resources so profitably today that we endanger the fundamental basis of health and justice for people today or tomorrow. But we, as a public health community, we need to use our voice and influence to ensure that on our watch we leave a legacy we can be proud of. That's why in this conference is the kickoff of the very important initiative. We have a new generation of public health professionals. We want to get them involved because it's in the name of their interest, of the future that we are working, so they have to be on board. This initiative was started on 6 June 2011, and for the first time during the conference we are going to have a EUPHA Next stand. We are encouraging their creativity in creating the slogan of the year, to water the public health tree, to meet important actors, to have a EUPHA Next coffee corners, and the first one, I'm happy to remind all of you who want to come, it will be opened by WHO Regional Director Susanna Jakob on 3:15 this afternoon. Lastly, we want people to be happy. And there is an evidence coming from this wonderful work by Fowler and Christakis, dynamic spread of happiness in large social network. People's happiness depends on the happiness of others with whom they are connected. This provides further justification for seeing happiness like health as a collective phenomenon. So my wish for you in this conference is based on evidence, and be happy and enjoy the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dear Finn, Chair of our Conference Council, dear Walter, President of EUPHA, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, dear students and young researchers, it's really an honor for me to open the 4th European Public Health Conference on behalf of ASPHER. This event truly embodies your commitment to European public health, and it is a real opportunity for us to come together to reflect on how far we have come and how far we have yet to go. It is a magnificent forum for sharing new developments in public health research, education, and practice, of which there are so many to share. To present a few achievements of our joint collaboration between ASPHER, EUPHA, but also EPHA, EMA, the European Health Management Association, and EuroHealth Network, we have created this year, all together, the Agency for Public Health Education Accreditation. This is the second agency which exists in the world after the Council on Education, EPH, Council on Education for Public Health Education, which is a US agency. This agency will be a real step forward for guaranteeing an education of public health of great quality all over Europe. I have also to mention that we have worked hardly on core competencies in public health with the delivery of 3 booklets which will be available in this conference. One booklet on the philosophy, the process and the vision of this movement on core competency programs, but also the European core competency for public health professionals, which are now delivered. Of course, this is a first step, and this is a moving area. We have also delivered something which will be very useful for our agency of accreditation, which will be the European core competencies for Master of Public Health. Also, I have to mention that we are now able to tell you that there is a new journal, which is not completely new. It has been relaunched by ASPHER, and it is not in competition with the European Journal of Public Health, which is very well renowned, and also on another aspect of the scope and the spectrum of the journals. This is Public Health Reviews, which is completely available, free of access, without any restriction for readers, but also for authors on the internet, and which is also with a small fee available on a paper basis. The third issue of Public health reviews will be on public health education. We will have a plenary session on Saturday on this topic. We are also proud to announce that we have created the European Academic Global Health Alliance. It is not only an ASPHER baby, I will say, because it has now 50 members. It's not all the 80 members from ASPHER, which are strongly committed in global health, but a part of them. And it's not 50 members from ASPHER. 20 members are out of ASPHER, but are European bodies, European schools, European departments involved in global health. And we have organized with our colleagues from the US and also from Africa and also from Asian and Pacific consortium of schools of public health, the third global summit of schools of public health in Washington, DC last week. We are also moving with task force thinking on ethics, on innovation in public health and good practice, on doctoral studies and on bachelor degrees. I also want to mention that notably this conference these days represents the fourth joint effort between EUPHA and ASPHER in working together on organizing this major European event, and represents the lasting and fruitful collaboration between these two key European public health organizations. I would, of course, also like to thank the local organizing team, which devoted themselves so wholeheartedly to putting this event together along with ASPHER and EUPHA. It is also important to underline the support of our private sponsors, of the European Commission, and ASPHER's and EUPHA's important links with WHO, which are also key in making this conference such a great success. We are here in Copenhagen, in the European capital of public health. Congratulations and thanks to all those who spent countless hours in the organizing committee and everyone else who has contributed to making this conference once more such a unique annual event. I would like to invite you, all of you, to the Andreas Stampa Award ceremony, which will take place today just after the plenary session from Susanna Jacob at 6:15. This is an annual award that ASPHER and EUPHA present to a key individual who has made a tremendous contribution to the field of public health. So, to all of you, thank you for being here. Welcome and enjoy this conference.
When I was a child, I learned that fairy tales are extremely important for developing your fantasy, your imagination, and your cultural attitude. In this country, we have had one of the best fairy tellers in the world. His name is Hans Christian Andersen. He is known in large part of the world. In some countries, you don't know of him. But when I got the proposal in our planning process that we should have something which was not only words, but also something else, I fully accepted that a group coming from the city where Hans Christian Andersen lived will present Hans Christian Andersen in their own way. Could I please ask this group to come to the place here?
I am just like the mirror of silent water. Everything reflects in me, and everything moves me. I am the tiny and almost invisible plant that grew up and found mercy in the sun of poetry. In Denmark I was born. It is there my home is. From there my world, and there my roots extend. You Danish tongue, as sweet as mother's voice is. To you, all my heartbeats do belong. To tell, and that's what I can see. I'll open to you the true feeling of all what life is meant to be. I'll give you a fairy tale and give you a life. I'll give you a fairy tale like life. Come, give us a song. I will make you live in with heart and a soul. Now you can dance in laughter and joy. Now you can sing in laughter and joy. 'Cause this is a fairy tale and this is your life. This is a fairy tale like life. This is a fairy tale and this is your life. This is a fairy tale like life. Join me on a magic trip, joyful and unending, to the home of fairy tales. We're just pretending. Anything can happen there, here and now and everywhere. Land of imagination never goes to fashion.
With the light and so divine, is every moment also fine.
And in every story, you'll find hope and glory. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to the fairy tale country of the world. The country of the most famous poet in the world ever. The country of Hans Christian Andersen. And to welcome you special to wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen, we'll sing the song for you about the most famous Dane ever. In other words, Hans Christian Andersen. I'm Hans Christian Andersen. I've come to say hello. I bring you all my fairy tales, and I am sure you know they'll fly to you from every page. I knew right from the start you'd come to love them everywhere. A tragedy or a comedy from the bottom of my heart.
Hans Christian Andersen, Andersen's in town.
An ugly duckling I was born, it was a misery. But I turned out a famous swan of words and poetry.
You see?
You'll find a witch or a sweet princess or a naked king.
God bless.
Two lovers in a chimney, or a prince, a soldier, haven't left the wall. I'm Hans Christian Andersen. Here there's a nightingale, and Thumbelina, Simple Simon, another fairy tale. Now here's a tale of a simple fool.
Just glance at page 2.
You la la la.
And you blossom it.
But you realize as you're reading it, it's also reading you. Hans Christian Andersen, 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 Andersen. I'm Hans Christian Andersen, Andersen's parade. Well, Hans Christian Andersen, I was only 14 years old when I left my native town. And my native town is not Copenhagen you're visiting today, no. The native town of Andersen, and indeed the native town of all of us on states now, is in another Danish island called Funen, and the name of the city is Odense. If you ever heard about that place before, you probably call it Odense or something, but in our tongue we call it Odense. Being 14, I waved goodbye for the first time. I hurried to wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen because I dreamt to become famous at the Royal Theatre. I knocked the door, I said, please let me in, but they looked at me at the theatre and then they said, no good, young man, you're much too ugly for the stage. Can you see? This is an inspiration for a world-famous story about the ugly duckling that turned out to be a swan. But now, as I know about health and welfare, it is a political thing, isn't it? Well, it is. So why don't we start with the political fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. The one about the nobleman, the king, the emperor, who is walking up and down the street with no clothes on at all. In other words, the emperor's new clothes.
The emperor is in his wardrobe.
Look at my wonderful clothes. Now I can find out whom of my stagemen are unfit for his post, and I can be able to tell the clever ones from the stupid ones.
Oh, how charming, how exquisite.
What pattern, what wonderful coloring.
It's an expensive fit,
Oh, it's beautiful, superb.
and it has an almost gracious approval. But what is that? I can't see anything myself. Am I stupid? Am I not fit to be an emperor? Oh, it's beautiful, delightful, superb.
The emperor's new clothes are magnificent. Mind the trail.
What a perfect fit. Goodness gracious.
Don't you think it fits me? Look at me, watch me carefully. Look at my new clothes.
And then the king, the emperor, with his nose up into the sky, he walked through the city, up and down and up and down and up and down the street. The suit of clothes is all together, is all together, is all together. The most remarkable suit of clothes that I have ever seen. In every color there is magic.
Believe it's magic, believe it's magic.
A red and blue and pink and purple, yellow, white and green. And the emperor, the king, he ran up and down the street until a child came from the crowd. I do hope that you remember what was said, because in the final chapter, this child points out the emperor and shouts out, well, could anybody remember what was said? Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be with intellectuals today. He's indeed naked, and it is the truth, even if grown-ups and especially politicians won't see it. The next fairy tale is perhaps one of the most famous in the world. It is translated into 142 different languages. That is indeed a lot, isn't it? And it is about a real princess, because you have arrived in a kingdom today. And here she is. The title of the story is The Princess and the Pea. It is about a prince traveling the world, and in the end, in the other end of the world, he finds a princess, because she is a real princess. The Princess and the Pea.
I have slept so dreadfully. I hardly closed my eyes all night. Lord knows what was in my bed. My body is black and blue all over, and that is simply dreadfully, because I am a real princess, and this pea will be placed in the museum, and I will marry the prince.
Yes, no one but a real princess would be able to feel a pea through 20 mattresses and 20 feather beds like it is in this world-famous story. We Danes, we consider this fairy tale worldwide known. We consider it so known that even the real Crown Prince of Denmark, some years ago, when he finally decided to marry and traveled to the other end of the world and found her, Crown Princess Mary. Do remember, she was from birth just a common girl, and she is indeed now the future queen of a real tiny kingdom. But the Crown Prince considered the story world famous. Therefore, he opened his speech to the press and to the people in Tasmania when presenting his fiancée, his Mary. He opened by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, let me tell you from the start that my Mary did not have to take the P test." That is an opening, isn't it? Yes, it is indeed. Here's another story about health. You know, there was a woman. She wanted so much by heart to have a baby of her own. But the medical business, this is going on in the good old days. There was nothing to do about. She couldn't get this child. So she walked to the good old witch. And the witch told her, "Go back home, then you'll find your own tiny baby in the bottom of a flower." And she did go back home. And she did indeed find Thumbelina.
I have tied the one end of my sash around the wonderful little butterfly and the other end to the water lily. Look how I float away. Listen to all the little birds around in the bushes, how they are singing. What a pretty little lady. I am no taller than your thumb.
Though you're not bigger than my thumb, sweet Thumbelina, don't be glum. Go, go, go! Thumbelina, Thumbelina, tiny little thing. Thumbelina dance, Thumbelina sing. Oh, Thumbelina, what's the difference if you're very small? If your heart is full of love, you're 9 feet tall. Though you're not bigger than my toe. Than my toe. Than my toe. Sweet Thumbelina, keep that glow. Then you'll grow, then you'll grow, then you'll grow. Thumbelina, Thumbelina, tiny little thing. Thumbelina dance, Thumbelina sing. Oh, Thumbelina, what's the difference if you're very small? If your heart is full of love, if your heart is full of love, you're 9 feet tall. Yes, indeed. If your heart is full of love, you too are 9 feet tall. That is a beautiful moral, isn't it? Well, about welfare. This last presentation from our hand today will be about welfare. But once again, we go back in time, 200 years back in time. Well, welfare, yeah, you know, once upon a time, there was a little girl. She was walking there in the street, New Year's Day, to sell matches. She's walking there in her bare feet, blue with cold, because can you imagine how cold it will be in Denmark in winter? It's so cold, and she's walking there trying to sell the matches. Please, will you excuse me, will you? But you know, everybody is in such a hurry. Nowadays, they call it stress. I don't know what they call it those days. But the little girl is walking there with a blue, cold fingers, freezing. And for the first time ever, the little girl dares to take out just one match. She never did before, because she knows if she does, her dad will see it, And when she comes home, he will beat her for having sold nothing. And still back home, it's cold as well. It's blowing right in the roof. She takes out one match. And in the flame, she imagines to see, or is this imagination? Her dead old grandmother, who was the only one who had ever been kind to her. And the girl believes, I am going to meet my old grandmother now, because she always told me, when a star is falling, a soul will go up to the Lord in heaven. In the morning, people will find her dead body there in the street, almost covered with snow. But they do notice a smile on her lips. A smile. Why this smile? This smile because that girl, she died believing. And that is something, isn't it? The little Matt's girl.
Grandma, oh, take me with you. I know I'll be gone when the match goes out, just like the warm stove, the wonderful rose goose, and the big Christmas tree. Grandma, take me with you.
Yes, the little Matt's girl. And to end this Andersen presentation, we'll sing a song for you, not about wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen you're visiting, no. A song about our native town. We are very modest people in Denmark. Therefore, the title of this final song in our presentation will be Odense, the fairy tale capital of the world. We are from Denmark, the capital of fairy tales come true. We are from Odense. Our hometown will welcome you, and while you're here, you're never blue in Odense. Everyone's living happily, at least they seem to be. And if they seem to be, it's perfectly all right to see now. And this old town is 1,000 years, that's quite a lot, and it's Odense. And then we have a bit of dancing on the stage. We're from Odense. Hey! We are from Odense. Every tale is a gift for you. There's a magic too. Every child and every grown-up all around this world now. By now you know where all the fairy tales come from. It's Odense. Thank you very much.
Dear youngsters and children and the group from Odense, thank you very much. I have grandchildren myself, and I cannot live without reading fairy tales because it's so fantastic. And what you just saw here was an introduction to some of the fairy tales, and I'll tell you that all the keynote speakers at this conference, they'll get this book, which is called The Complete Illustrated Works of Hans Christian Andersen. And that's just to honor all of you who have some of the soft values, so to speak. It was important from my perspective when I began organizing this conference also to take cultural and natural environmental values into the concept of public health. And therefore, we have had pre-conferences on music and health and on nature and health. And some of you may have participated in these conferences, but that's part, at least, of my picture. I'm a big boy, still loving all these fantastic issues which we can learn from the literature of those very fine poets like Hans Christian Andersen. I'm now moving to the next session, I did invite our Minister of Health to open this conference from a formal perspective, but we've just had an election in Denmark, and we simply did not know what was going to happen. And we've got a brand new and young Minister of Health. And therefore we have no, so to speak, formal political opening of this conference. So I'm just telling you now, I'm opening the conference, being the chair of the local organizing committee, and then moving into one of the next plenary sections, which is called Rival Welfare State Models and Their Impact on Family and Child Welfare. And it is presented by Gosta Esping-Andersen, who is a professor in Spain. You can read about these keynote speakers in the program. He is in fact a Danish person, but I learned that he is a more or less world famous person because he has created models and understanding in research of different welfare models and try to evaluate the different impacts of such things. And we thought it was important to expose you as European persons to the different welfare models which in fact do exist. I have lived long time in the Scandinavian world with a welfare model, which is a Scandinavian one, but they are different models. And the exciting thing is to learn by those who have done research into this, how is the impact and what can we tell each others in the developing European world on the different welfare models and related to public health. So Gosta, would you please come to the stage and present your case? Thank you.
Hello there. Thank you for inviting me to your conference. My area of expertise lies quite a distance from public health issues. I'm actually a dilettante on the topics that you are experts on, so you'll have to put up with that. Finn Kamper-Jorgensen asked me to, as he mentioned briefly, to situate health outcomes in terms of differences in welfare state models and performance in at least within the advanced world. So being a dilettante in the public health area, I had to do some crash reading through the literature. I knew it peripherally, but I didn't know it very well. And what struck me is what he said had brought me fame and fortune, namely developing distinct welfare state model typologies and applying it to a lot of areas. I suddenly realized it doesn't work for health. So what I'm going to end up concluding is in terms of direct effects, differences in welfare state design really have only minor impact. The real impact goes indirectly, especially via how welfare states deal with and minimize inequalities, poverty in particular. And in particular, within poverty, it's child poverty. I've been roaming around a lot in also kind of political circles, worked a lot on retirement policy, and I tried over and over again to convince politicians that the best slogan they could use for a good reform is good reforms begin with babies. It hasn't really had much of an echo effect, but I still want to push that slogan. And here too. I've put up some slides to walk you through the story. Beginning with welfare state models and differentials in welfare state design. There are various ways to classify models. An old classical one was developed by Richard Titmuss many, many decades ago, where he distinguished between a residual and institutional type of welfare state. What has become sort of the commonplace distinction today is between what we call the liberal model, the social democratic model, and conservative model. There are variations on these concepts, it doesn't really matter. Here clearly what we're trying to denote is that there is kind of a political thrust behind these differences in design. As you can see here, schematically put, there are important differences in how they're designed, how they meet needs, and what kind of clientele they define as being included in the system. The liberal model has traditionally, and here maybe I should give you some prototype examples. US would be the most prototype of them all, but I would also include the UK, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia. There are variations, of course. What we're talking about is kind of ideal types. Now, in the liberal tradition, the idea is that it's only when there is market failure that government should intervene. When there's abject need that cannot be satisfied via market transaction. These welfare states tend to be very highly targeted to populations that have a clearly demonstrated need. This is in stark contrast to Scandinavian and especially social democratic tradition, in which the idea was citizenship should be the basis. All should be included similarly because we're all citizens in the same entity. The conservative tradition, which is actually the pioneer of social protection, Germany in particular and Austria, it is social insurance. This is a model that relies very heavily on a male breadwinner, traditionally, that could, via his employment contract, lifelong employment security, could insure on behalf of all the family members for which he was responsible. So here is a very distinct, different model of how to meet risks. In terms of coverage, of course, targeting becomes exclusionary, and the degree to which benefits are targeted defines more or less the limits of the population group. One thing that is very clear from research is that despite the claim that targeted benefits to the most needy ought to be the most efficient way of resolving social problems, what we learn is it's a very inefficient way. The per person cost is very high due to high administrative overhead costs, and they are usually not very target efficient in terms of meeting the real needs. The social democratic tradition, in contrast, has always gone for a universal approach. And this is most clearly seen in Scandinavia. This, however, depends on what kind of programs we're talking about. In a lot of countries, including the liberal ones and including the conservative ones, the basis of inclusion in healthcare is universal. National healthcare system in Britain, same is the case in Spain, the same is the case in Italy. So the universalistic aspect that defines virtually all programs in Scandinavia is in many other countries shared, but basically only in healthcare. And finally, in the conservative, as I said, it's employment that's important. We should probably not, or we would probably not understand welfare states well unless we situate them in the context of what are the main institutions of society that provide welfare, that define how you meet uncertainties in life and risks in life. For most people, most of their lives is either family or the market that is the primary source of welfare. So in order to understand the welfare state, we have to situate it in terms of its relative role in that triad, market, family, and then of course the state being the third. What is very characteristic of the liberal model is its assumption that the market works for the vast majority of the population, hence targeting for those who fail in the market. In the social democratic, it is assumed that both markets and family are potentially prone to failure for most of the population at some point in one's life. This has led to a model in which, from the point of view of welfare insurance, the social democratic model has sort of implicitly marginalized the role and the dependence on either markets and or on the family. The conservative model is especially unique in terms of its strong familialistic assumptions and actually ideology. It is a model in which it is assumed that the best possible source of care should be within the family. It is only when the family fails that it would be reasonable and justified for government to intervene in terms of either servicing the family, caring needs, or also in terms of economic support. Just think of it's very recent that Germany reformed its social assistance law. Until very recently, a needy person or family would not be eligible for social assistance if some other family members could provide for them. That's familialism. Most people, when they examine welfare states, hone very much in on income support and income transfers and ignore the servicing side of the welfare state. That is kind of a natural, instinctive thing to do if you're not in a Scandinavian welfare state, because those are the only ones that are really servicing intensive. Either the liberal model or the conservative model have only really within health any intensive servicing to families. So at the bottom of this table, as you can see, I've tried to identify some prototypical examples of these kinds of welfare state models, US being kind of the core example of a liberal, targeted, minimal residual welfare state, Denmark, Sweden being usually held up as the prototypical social democratic version. Germany and Italy, in their internal variations, represent very well conservative tradition. So much for that. Now, if you were to look at virtually any dimensions of welfare distributions, poverty, income distributions, you would find that these differences in models, they explain a lot. What they don't explain are health outcomes, or only very marginally so. Let's start with three types of indicators, see if there's any notable variation here. I took health spending as a percentage of GDP, public role in the overall package of health spending, and then physicians per capita. On all three, you don't see any dramatic differences across these regimes. The only dramatic differences are outliers, and the US is a systematic outlier. Spending too much, doing too little is one way of putting it. Otherwise, if you're in Spain, or if you're in Italy, or if you're in Germany, or if you're in Sweden, or in Britain, there is really not much of a difference in terms of what you can directly attribute to in terms of connections between the welfare state and some health outcomes. If we go on and hone in on whether there are any kind of patterns of welfare state effects linked to inequalities in health, here I've used two. One, I think most people here are familiar with, which is the HI index, is kind of an equivalent of a Gini coefficient for those who know something about income distribution research. In terms of access to specialists is an indicator I used here. And what it basically shows is whether there are a lot of differences across the income quintiles of households and their access to specialist services in any given society. The other indicator I took here is self-reported very bad health. And here I look at the ratio of what is the incidence of reporting very bad health in the bottom quintile as opposed to in the top. Now, here you can find a little bit, not in terms of access to specialists. The inequality is read out of how large is the number. As I say here, large numbers spell bad outcomes. You will notice that one country, which is a member of the liberal residual group, is actually the most egalitarian of all the countries in terms of access to specialists. And on the other hand, Finland looks very inegalitarian on this count. It doesn't fit with what we would have expected from a welfare regime point of view. But if you look across the regime, you see there's really no difference on the means. There is, however, and here's a very surprising thing, when you look at the proportion who report very bad health, there is a bias in disfavor of the liberal regime. That is rather noticeable. And here, the UK surprisingly scores very badly, despite what we just saw, that it looked like it's a very egalitarian system in terms of access. This doesn't square very well. In fact, what I think, I'm persuaded, in fact, that hides behind this number is not the welfare state, but the incidence of poverty, and especially child poverty. And I'm going to get back to that. This is the first signal that the smoking gun is not the welfare state, but its indirect effects on the distribution of economic resources and families. A final look at any possible welfare state health connections is in this table, where I hone in on children, as my slogan would have me do. And here is where you find, and this is what international research that has focused on this issue hones in on all the time. It's really one of the few indicators where there is a correlation, namely, especially infant mortality. Scandinavia is a great performer in terms of minimizing infant mortality compared to virtually all other countries. And as a group, the social democratic model clearly has a superior effect compared to the others where there really is no difference. And that also goes for low birth weight. You can also see that, especially in terms of infant mortality, the standard deviation for the social democratic group is relatively small, saying to us that the systems are very homogeneous, in a sense, compared to the others. You can see that the standard deviation in terms of infant mortality is very high in the conservative group. That's driven by Italy, which has horrendous levels of child mortality from a point of view of advanced country comparisons. In fact, here we're back again to a signal. This has probably a lot to do with the fact that Italy also has high levels of poverty in child families. So far, I think I would conclude that a direct connection between welfare state design and health outcomes, however I have measured them at least, is rather on the margin rather than central. The issue, however, is that the effects are indirect, and here they're important. It has a lot to do, and we have so much research that has shown us that income inequalities are powerfully related to health outcomes, and especially poverty. One thing we have learned a lot in recent research in terms of the effects of income inequalities is they are non-linear. The bad effects are especially concentrated way down in the bottom of the income distribution. But in the middle ranges of the income distribution, there are not much differences. So it's non-linear effects that are very dominant here. And that is why I shall hone in very much on poverty as a special concern. But just to illustrate, we have data on longevity or life expectancy, and we know that for men in the top end of the income distribution compared to the bottom end of the income distribution, they can count on average about 10 or 8 to 10 years longer lives. For women, it's slightly smaller. I think it's about 5-6 years differential due to where they are in the income distribution. But those are very, very big effects. All right. Let us first see how welfare states do, or nations do, in terms of the incidence of poverty. One thing we do know is that in most countries over the past 10 to 15 years, poverty rates have been climbing rather disturbingly. So, Scandinavia is an exception to the general rule. Some countries, poverty, and especially child poverty, has been on the rise, more or less as a correlate of overall increases in income inequalities in our societies. You can see here that there is a clear, distinct difference by these regimes in terms of the incidence of overall poverty and especially in terms of child poverty. The differences in Scandinavia on both counts are very small. It's 5 or 6% in the countries, be it in child poverty or be it in terms of overall poverty. But look at Italy, for example, 18% child poverty. US is also about 18%, or 17%, sorry, it is. UK also has extremely high child poverty rates. What is also interesting is that in most countries, the child poverty rate exceeds the overall rate of poverty. That, however, in one group of countries is exactly the opposite in the Social Democratic group. There, the lowest incidence of poverty you can find are among families with small children. This, of course, is the first indicator that some countries are good and some countries are bad at managing poverty and poverty risks. But when we focus on poverty, we have to remember that I would say about 90% of this public have been poor sometime in their life, at least when they were studying. You tell your children or grandchildren, in the case of Finn, when I had those years where it was just bread and water, and I was struggling, it was really hard. We've all experienced that. That's totally uninteresting. What is interesting is persistent poverty. Well, it's an interesting story to tell your grandchildren, to get them to shape up, right? But what is decisive is persistent poverty. And here this is my own research that I can finally kind of push on you. This compares a number of countries that also represent these different welfare regimes in terms of how persistent is poverty. And what we look at is of those who in year 1 were poor, or in year 0 were poor, how many 1 year after, 2 years after, and 3 years after. It's called Kaplan-Meier estimation. As you can see, in some countries, and I'm very proud that Denmark here is an excellent performer, the vast majority of initial poverty disappears very quickly. It's those students who were 2 years there on bread and water. By 3 years, there's virtually nobody left. But look at the US on the other extreme. among those who were initially poor in year 0, more than half of them, 60% almost, are still poor after 3 years. They're just stuck there forever and ever and ever. That is also the case in some other countries, but US here is a true extreme case of poverty traps. And that is, I think, one of the key reasons why the low-income population in the US, health-wise and in terms of all other kinds of child indicators, does so comparatively much worse than virtually any other European country. Let me just see. One way to illustrate what the cost of poverty is was done by the Urban Institute, a very high-grade kind of research center and think tank in the US that's done some of the best research ever done on areas related to this. They have tried, as Americans like to do, to cash out the costs of child poverty. And they did it for the US, and they conservatively estimated that the GDP loss attributable directly to child poverty in the US is around 4%. That is exactly what the combined total child care and elderly care in Scandinavia costs as a percent of GDP. The effects that the Urban Institute identified are evenly distributed on 3 dimensions. Education effects, less education. A child in poverty in the US will on average have 2 years less of schooling than a non-poor child. That child will subsequently have, as an adult, earnings that are 30% less than non-poor children. And the worst of it all is that the syndrome is perpetuated from generation to generation because children born in poverty are more than twice as likely also to become poor parents once they form families. Education is a third of the cost. Health is another third of the cost. And the third has to do with behavioral adverse consequences such as incarceration, delinquency, crime. Maybe some of you know that the annual cost of incarceration is just about identical to the annual tuition cost at Harvard University. It's very expensive to produce failures in society. Now, sorry, wait a minute. I'm just going to catch up here. Let me just wait with that a moment. What do we know in research in terms of the connection between income inequalities, poverty, and health? Many of you here, I think, are more familiar with this than I am. I'm relying on a lot of research, and I think even some of the people's whose research I'm relying on I'm pretty sure they're even present. One clearly demonstrated effect is infant mortality, but also death in childhood more generally. One study I came across that really impressed me is that the children in poverty will have a 50% higher chance of dying before they reach 14 years of age. That really was a disturbing statistic to me. This is a study by Wood that some people may know. They will also have twice the chance or incidence of bad health status. And there are some areas of health in particular where children of poverty really do poorly. One is respiratory problems. Another one would be in the area of diarrhea and that, or in pneumonia. Those are areas where child illness is much, much higher in poor families than in the rest of the child population. They also, and this is American research, they have twice the rate of hospitalization as non-poor children. A lot of this is driven by one underlying health factor, namely low birth weight. But a lot of other health problems are also related to another correlate of low income and low education, namely obesity and child obesity. And there's a growing evidence not only of the socially skewed incidence of child obesity, but also of its very bad health effects in turn. One thing in this area of research that is an unanswered question, we don't have the final answer. So we don't know what is the smoking gun. That has to do with, is it a direct income effect or a poverty effect in terms of very low income? Or is it selection into poverty? There may be characteristics of the parents that explain why they're poor and also why their children do very poorly. Could be, for example, they're slovenly people, drug addicts, they may be mentally disturbed. There may be a lot of factors involved in the characteristics of the parents that explain why they have no income and also why everything goes wrong in these families. Now, we have never been able to sort this out in empirical research to a full extent. But in terms of explaining cross-national differences of the magnitudes we find, it's unlikely that this kind of selection is the main story for two reasons. One is it's very unlikely that there are more mentally disturbed, or the proportion of mentally disturbed parents is higher in some countries than in others. It's very difficult to imagine that the proportion of mentally disturbed or otherwise problematic parents is 4 times higher in the US than it is in Denmark. I doubt that is what's the main story of these differences in poverty rates. So that's one factor. The real factor, I think, has to do with how effective are welfare states in limiting poverty. Now, you already saw the persistence of poverty. Here's a big table. Perhaps you can just look at the bold numbers that represent these regime means that I presented earlier. Now, one thing that is striking, measured before taxation and income distribution via the welfare state, the incidence of child poverty is pretty much the same whether you live in Sweden or in Spain. There are no differences really. It's somewhere there floating between 25-30% in all countries. There are very little variations. Finland is kind of an exceptional country here. But before the welfare state enters with its tax clause and its handouts, there are very little differences in child poverty rates. But look at it then post-redistribution. Boom, that's where the big differences are. As we know, Scandinavia has very, very little child poverty. As we know, especially the liberal group has very high child poverty rates. The welfare state is very effective in Scandinavia. It's very ineffective in the targeted countries. Here we have exactly the kind of illustration of the kind of counterproductive logic built into targeted systems of social assistance. So some countries are much better at poverty reduction than others. How do they do it? Well, almost 99.9% of our research has focused on the tax transfer nexus of welfare states, which is, of course, a big part of the story. One area that we have very little research on is also the impact of welfare state-provided services to families. And as this table suggests, it's a big part of the story where you have intensive servicing to families. And that is basically, apart from healthcare, limited to the Nordic countries. So you can see, as this one shows, that not only is service spending as a proportion of total much larger in the Scandinavian group, but also its effect, or its redistributive effect, is so much greater than in any other country. If we take out health and education, all but the Nordic countries virtually do nothing, or have at least provide no kind of servicing that has any redistributive effect. Now, the servicing of welfare states focuses largely on the two tail ends of the life course: child families, child care facilities in particular, and old age, and especially ultra-aged populations, that is 80 plus, when caring needs, so like residential homes, home health services, etc., begin to become serious. What we know, first of all, is that very high quality external childcare, but underlining high quality, as you find it in Denmark, has very positive effects for virtually any dimension of child well-being and child life chances that you could mention. It has a huge dividend in terms of educational returns later on. We have pretty clear estimates by now that, and I've done it for Denmark as well, that children who have gone to quality childcare or preschool institutions are 1 year ahead of children who did not when they start first day in school, age 6 or 7. It's big dividends. And if it's very high quality, the dividend persists throughout the child's life, up into the adulthood. You can see the effects are continuously positive. There are also very positive dividends for child health. The only area in which there is doubt about whether high-quality child care institutions have a positive effect is in terms of behavioral problems. There is quite a lot of research that also suggests that maybe they also create adverse behavioral effects. There's also logic to elderly care that is similar to the logic of childcare. Namely, they augment mothers' or women's labor supply, and substantially so. And what we know as rule of thumb number 1 in poverty research is the most effective policy against poverty is that mama works. That is effective. The probability of child poverty falls by a factor of 400%, when mama works. Now, the absence of childcare means that mothers are constrained to stay home. So in Germany, the average woman post-birth stays away from the labor market typically 3 years. That has long-term lifetime earnings effects that are huge. The same goes for the typical familialistic caring model in terms of elderly care, namely the daughter stops working if she was working at all. The old assumption was that she had just been a housewife all her life, but she would have to stop there somewhere in her 50s to care for the frail, dependent, elderly relative. Again, huge income losses to families. So here is a mechanism that has been very little examined compared to others, but which is very important, and that is why we should probably focus more on the servicing side of welfare states. I want to almost end up, with something that you might find completely irrelevant. Why is this guy talking about this in this context of public health? I think I can persuade you why. These are data I have calculated on the SHARE data sets, which some of you may know, which looks especially at intergenerational relations and the situation of the elderly societies. It also has a lot of health items. And this is trying to answer one question or respond to one very frequently posed issue, which is, if we externalize care for the elderly or for the children, we weaken and erode family ties. That is, the assumption of familialism is that mutual caring is the cement of the family. If we begin to erode families, of course, then we are potentially in trouble. So I thought, well, let's look at whether externalizing care at the tail end of the life course, what effects do they actually have on family life or family solidarities? Now, one way to look at it is in terms of the intensity of caring. Now, those of you who have an elderly or ultra-aged relative in Scandinavia will know that if the relative is very, very dependent, full-blown Alzheimer, that person will be in a residential home. But the vast majority can get by staying in their home and getting home health services, which can become very intensive in cases of very intensive need. Where you don't have those kinds of services, a la Spain, a la Italy, it's essentially relatives you must depend on. That means, given longevity increases in our new demographics, it means that the incidence of intensive caring needs is growing very rapidly in familialistic countries. This means that essentially when you care for a frail elderly, it's almost a full-time job. Look at Italy there, almost 30 hours a week when there is a caring incidence. Or in Spain, 16 hours. Look at Scandinavia, well, here, Denmark, not even 3 hours a week. So the familialistic ideologists, they would say, look, Denmark has no more family. But then look at incidents, namely how many in the family show up and how frequently do they show up. Denmark is twice as much family as Spain or Italy, or for that matter, France. There is a logic here, and you could see it also if you looked at the other side of it when grandparents take care of their grandkids. The logic is externalized servicing for the frail means that walking into a caring obligation is so much more relaxed, and you're much more likely to do it. If you're facing a full-time job, essentially, of caring for an Alzheimer relative, it means most people would stay away, or you assign one to specialize in that act, usually the daughter. So, this may not have direct impact on how you think about public health, but indirectly it does. If you want to strengthen families' involvement in caring situations, I think there's a very good case to be made to externalize the heavy burden of the caring. Now, so much for that. I just wanted to end up with a little sort of footnote. We know that very bad health is associated with low income. So poverty is a threat to our health distribution in our societies. There's very bad news on a lot of fronts in this regard. The first bad news is the trend is towards heightened income inequality distributions in virtually all societies. The widening of differentials has been rather strong. In some countries, it's been very strong. Sweden, surprisingly, is, over the past 10, 15 years, one of the leaders in terms of rising inequality, albeit starting from a very egalitarian starting point. There are also family demographics that are very threatening in terms of potentially polarizing. One has to do with the distribution of divorce and lone motherhood, or lone parenthood. It used to be that divorce was very highly concentrated in the upper echelons of society. What we're seeing is that the upper end of society now has diminished divorce and heightened parent stability. The opposite is the case at the bottom. They're becoming increasingly unstable, and the incidence of lone parenthood has become very heavily concentrated at the very bottom end of the income distribution or the educational distribution in our societies. That is, what we are facing is a potential wave of demographic polarization that will worsen, no doubt, also the nexus between poverty, low income, job instability, and poor health, not only for the parents, but especially, I think, for the kids. And this is one of the great challenges, I think, that we are going to be facing here in the next decades to come, namely this partial or very heavily demographically driven polarization in families with children. And I stop with that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Please have a look in your program, and you can see that there are oral sessions beginning at 2 o'clock until the next 1.5 hours. And then I remind you of the reception tonight, that there's a reception here in the Bella Center at 6:45, and there is a reception at the City Hall at 7:30. So now have a good break and find the session you find of interest. Thank you, and thank you for a very interesting presentation of welfare models.